Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fire of These Times. I'm your host, Dana El-Kurd. Today, we're joined by Pablo Abufom. He's a third-generation Palestinian Chilean, wears many hats, as we will discuss. He's a philosopher by training, also a biologist by training, a translator, co-founder of a new Palestinian Chilean press, Al Press, and an activist with the Coordinadora por Palestina. So, we're going to be discussing today the Palestinian Chilean community, activism in that community, and what we can learn from the Palestinian Chilean experience and more recent activism about organizing more or less in under the American hegemonic sphere to varying degrees. So yeah, thank you so much, Pablo, for being here.
Hey, Dana, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure, always.
Great. So yeah, I just gave like an intro, but perhaps you want to tell us a little bit more about, who you are and how you came to Palestinian organizing. Maybe I'll just give a more context to the listeners. I've been doing field work in Chile, kind of on and off, and hope to do more field work in Chile in the near future. And I met Pablo there because I was working on activism in Palestine, on Palestine, sorry, activism on Palestine, and was really fascinated by the perspective that Pablo and the organization he works with, the Coordinadora por Palestina, had on the issue. So yeah, I'll throw it back to you. Let me know how you got into this issue.
It's I think it's a very rather shared trajectory, I think, for people in the diaspora. That it's, in my case in particular, I was born into a family that it's my great grandparents came from Bejala in Palestine in the early 20th century. So it's part of a larger migration from Palestine to South America and Chile in particular. And they decided to settle down at small town in the valleys of the central part of Chile, which for some resembles the motherland, the Jalas landscape, uh, but also smaller cities that were open for new, I would say, entrepreneurs, merchants, people who were willing to invest and work in commerce in general. And so that made them uh, I would say, quickly assimilate into Chilean culture. They were all Christians. I think that's important. The majority of the Palestinian community in Chile is Christian, either because they were Orthodox Christians when they came, or they became Catholics in the way, like during the decades. And my family was not particularly active in the Palestinian struggle or in Palestinian organizations, but people who were very close to the family were. So when I was I don't know, like 5 or 6 years old, there were friends of family who were part of the PLO, who were Chileans or Palestinians who were in Chile working for the PLO in the Chilean office. And I remember clearly being invited sort of jokingly when I was like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old, invited to the first Intifada. And that, I think that has it definitely marked my own identity as Palestinian in the sense that I understood that being Palestinian was being involved in a struggle, which for me was a very close experience since in Chile we were under a dictatorship around the time that the dictatorship ended. And so there were huge processes of change in Chile and Palestine at the same time. It was the Intifada and the road towards the Oslo Accords, and it was um, the post-dictatorship period in Chile that came after a very relevant negotiation between the civil administration and the military dictatorship. And so it was kind of like, for many people, it was sort of like the same process. And many Palestinians were older than me, who were, I don't know, in their 20s or 30s in the late 80s and early 90s. They saw that treason, the PLO treason by signing the accords, in the same way that they saw the transactions and negotiations between the dictatorship and the new governments in the post-dictatorship who were supposedly center-left or leftist parties. So it's interesting how Chile is marked by a relevant transformation in its internal politics in a way that is very connected to the Palestinian experience in completely different contexts, trajectories, etc. But in relevant ways, they were similar. And so, in the context of that historical moment, I was part of a family that was not highly politicized in terms of Palestine, except my grandmother, who was always, in a way, talking about Palestine and keeping the memory of, not just the culture and the cuisine and the music and dance, etc., like the cultural element, which is, as everyone knows, very common in all diasporas, but also in terms of like talking to us as kids, as their grandkids about Palestine. Uh, and I don't know, the role of the rest of the Arab countries in
Betraying Palestine.
in betraying Palestine and not supporting the Palestinian liberation. So in that context, for me, Palestine was always present, but my own process of becoming political or learning about politics and getting involved in politics came through radical leftist politics. And so I was not highly involved with Palestinian organizing, with pro-Palestinian organizing, because in my small town, all I saw was people who were interested in the ethno or national identity and cultural things, and not really political. Most, I don't know how many, but a lot of Chilean Palestinians are rich and or right wing, and so there was no place for me in my political ideas in the
The
context
overlap
of
with the Palestinian issue.
in the Palestinian community that I knew of. And so then I moved to Santiago, the capital city, and I got even more involved in radical leftist politics and social movements. And for a long time, for me, the Palestinian struggle was sort of like a part of the, I don't know, the universal revolutionary struggle, against capitalism and colonialism, imperialism. But it was not an issue or a space for organizing that I felt called to be part of particularly. But then with time, and the uh, permanent siege and blockade of Gaza and the attacks by Israel, and then most definitely after October 7th, I felt that something had changed in terms of the place that Palestinian struggle would have in the context of that general universal struggle for liberation, in a way that was not so clear for me and many others in the past decades, especially in Chile, which had been in at least for 20 years or 30 years in a long process of politicization, of student mobilizing and labor mobilizing, and then of course the huge revolt that we had, the popular revolt in October 2019. And so there's a lot of work to do in terms of politics in Chile. Um, and also most of the people that I knew that were involved in Palestinian organizing were in places or groups that were exclusively Palestinian. That for me made really not sense. It made no sense to be in like ethnic, like defining membership by
Ethnic
ethnic,
affinity.
yeah,
Hmm.
or procedents. And so, yeah.
So I really want to talk more about particularly the Coordinadora and like after October 7th and broadly, like you've already kind of touched on a little bit about Chilean politics, the 2019 protests. But before we get into that, I think we need to kind of scaffold for the listeners. Um, People often don't know about the Palestinians in Latin America and the Palestinians in Chile in particular. The Palestinians in Chile being the biggest community in Latin America, of Palestinians, I mean.
Allegedly.
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 Well,
Yeah.
we let's just claim it. Let's just claim it. I feel like it's
Yeah,
a claim to
yeah, yeah,
fame. We keep pushing the narrative, pushing the myth.
yeah.
No, but perhaps you can maybe explain briefly about who the Palestinian Chilean community, like who they are, how they got there. I know we don't need to get into like all the deep history, but specifically that will help then explain how do they approach the Palestinian issue, so why they approach the Palestinian issue in this kind of just national affinity or even ethnic affinity as like being Palestinian Arab. And they organize along these particular Palestinian groups, often about cultural expressions of their identity. Um, and yeah, who are these people?
Yeah. It's very interesting that I mean the first waves of migration from the Middle East to South America and the Americas in general was in the late 19th century. And so by that time, you can see it was in the process of the uh, sort of like the dissolution, the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, the colonial expansion from Britain to the Middle East. And so there was a lot of conflict and confrontation and crisis, of course, that made a lot of people think that they should go somewhere else and find like better perspectives for mostly their economic lives. And so the idea was to send young Arab men to find something to do in other countries, in particular in the Americas, that sounded at the time as a land of promise. The same as I mean, it's like going to the US but cheaper, I guess, uh, in
Well,
terms
the
of that
US had
migration.
particular immigration laws that meant that brown
Exactly,
people couldn't come. So lots
exactly,
of Arabs
exactly.
ended up in South America. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And so they came, some of them with their labor force, and some of them with some capital by, I don't know, selling property back in Palestine and then coming to something here. And and they found societies that were, as I was saying, they were open, not to foreigners necessarily, not to Arabs in particular, but um, to new influxes of capital and work
To
and
investment.
labor.
Yeah.
Yeah, to investment and labor force. And I think that since they were Christians and they were not, um, I don't know, and you know the thing with being Arab and whiteness is that it's not as simple as saying like an I don't know someone uh, like an African American and people from African descent, you know, um, not just because of skin color, but also because of the idea of Arabs being uh, something between either complete barbarians or highly educated people. And some of the people who came already had, I don't know, commerce experience. So they were able to insert themselves into the Chilean society in a way that gave them a space as mostly, you know, mostly working in commerce, either informal commerce, like traveling and selling stuff to different people in different cities, or establishing themselves in shops and stores. Um, and so I think that both that element, that economic element, the fact that they were Christians, the fact that they were willing to integrate and assimilate, um, and that and also the fact that by the 1920s, and especially after the Citizenship Act of the British Mandate in 1925, there were a lot of Palestinians who were left. Uh, uh, Basically, they were stuck outside of Palestine, and they start building their own community in every country in Latin America that they were living in, and building their own identity as Palestinians, as diasporic Palestinians, as like the foundations of their own collective experience. Um, so they identify even more heavily as Palestinians due to the fact that they were not able to return to Palestine. This is something that Nadim Bawalsa explains in a very excellent way in his book, Transnational Palestine,
We'll put it in the show
which is
notes.
about the migration to Latin America before 1948. And so what's interesting is several elements. It was a migration that came in times of crisis, imperial crisis, intercapitalist wars, the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, the beginning of a Zionist occupation and colonization of Palestine. Um, and so their relationship with Palestine was not was very nationalistic in the sense that it was based on the dream, the fantasy, the utopia of coming back to a place that you were not being able to come back. I mean, you were not allowed to come back, or you were not giving citizenship. But it was before 1948. So it was before the idea that Palestinians are, by definition, the enemies of Israel and are defined by that antagonism and the role that the international community has in that and all of that. And so I think that wave of migration was not as militant in the way to understand the struggle for
It's not
Palestine.
an anti-colonial
Exactly, exactly.
vision, framing of the identity, which it's actually very fascinating because, of course, the Zionist movement and people who are pro-Israel often will make the claim that Palestinians don't exist or only exist in opposition to Israel. And it's like this community that began its migration in the 1870s, 1880s from the Ottoman Empire before Palestine existed still had a Palestinian national sentiment because Palestinian national
Exactly.
sentiment was already um, developing in Palestine,
Yeah,
unrelated
yeah,
to some degree to the Zionist movement.
exactly. It was more connected to being against the Ottoman Empire and then the British, which which were the ones who brought the Zionists to Palestine in a way, or supported that movement. And so, anyways, what I think it's interesting is that after 1948, the same migration started to change because then you had people who were actually, fleeing the Nakba, becoming refugees in different countries, coming to Chile because they had family or they knew that there was like a large Palestinian community. And then you had more people who were Muslims, for instance, and also more people who had been involved in the process of fighting against the occupation. And I think that changed, sort of changed. You can see it even in the press, in the local press, that the Palestinian and the Arab community in general established in Chile. Like they had, newspapers or periodicals, where I don't know, weeklies, and they served the function of connecting people and, like, I don't know, telling stories about there was some couple that got married in this town, and so there was a way of like making the connections between a community that was diasporic and dispersed in a country that is also very huge, very large and very sprawled. And but then in the 50s and 60s, you start seeing in the press, in their journals or magazines, you start seeing, talks about Palestinian liberation and nationalism and pan-Arabism and, tributes to Gamal Abdel Nasser. And, like there's a more political moment for Palestinians and Arabs in general in Chile. And then, of course, the PLO they knew that they had to have a role in Chile, and so there were people connected, especially from the left, but also from the political center, It's like the communists and the radical leftists were members of the PFLP, and the Christian Democrats or other people in the center of the political spectrum in Chile were members of Fatah or other, like centrist group in Palestine.
They found their
And that's
political
interesting.
homes. Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's like there's this correlation between political homes here in Chile and in Palestine. And then I think something that is super relevant for the Palestinian community in Chile is the role that those Arabs and Palestinians who were able to make a lot of money and become relevant industrialists in the textile sector or in commerce or even finance, like founding banks and stuff like that, they became a very important part of the fabric of Chilean capitalism, or the particular forms of Chilean capitalism in the 30s and 40s that was in the process of, as in other countries in Latin America, in the process of industrializing, of state-driven development. And so I think that Arabs in Chile found a place there. And they became, by the 60s, they had become, uh, I would say, super relevant, or even the major capitalists in Chile. Oh, no,
So very
and
much
I don't know.
integrated in power.
Yes, and political power, but mostly economic power. And so the notion of Palestinians and Arabs in general in Chile being business people it's very common, and it's like part of the idea that people have about Arabs, which I guess it's like a prejudice or an idea that it's common in other places. And so, for instance, by the time the Popular Unity government came, Salvador Allende's government, the first factory, the first textile factory that was expropriated by the workers, it was a Palestinian owned. It's the Yarur family. They owned the largest textile manufacturing um, factory, and they even built like like a neighborhood for their own workers. So it's an interesting, the kind of very modern capitalist
Like a factory town.
family. Yeah, like a factory town. So, and that was the first factory to be occupied by the workers
Mhm.
and expropriated. So that tells you that they had a very relevant. I don't think it's like a coincidence or just like a contingent element in the Chilean history, in the history of the Popular Unity government, that the first factory was a Palestinian owned. And this is for people who might be interested in this. There's a book by Peter Wynne, the historian, that's called Weavers of Revolution, that it's particularly about that process.
Mhm.
And then when the coup happened in 1973, and we had 17, 18 years of dictatorship, and the influence of the neoliberal economic policies on the transformations in Chile, that was like a new moment for the Arab and Palestinian community in Chile to become even more powerful. And since the whole project of neoliberal transformations in Chile was about opening borders, focusing the economy on the export and the importation of products and exportation of just raw materials, the Arab capitalists moved very quickly from industry to finance, um, or general commerce, like owning department stores and stuff like that. And so they were very clever, I think, in how to stay in power, mostly economic power, but then also political power. So you had several ministers of the Pinochet cabinet by the 80s that were Arabs or even Palestinian. And so there is a connection between the wealth of a sector of Palestinian Chileans and the dictatorship. So there's been always a very close relationship with the Chilean state to be part of the capitalist development in Chile, whichever way it takes, the state-driven development or a neoliberal moment, Yeah,
So do
that's
you
part
think
of
that
the
that
way they integrated. I think that's part of the way they integrated to Chile.
Mhm. So you think that because of this role that they played in building Chile, essentially in the various uh, parts of its development, and their integration into power and their proximity to power, you think that that means it colors their engagement with the Palestinian issue today, um, and how the kind of established Palestinian groups approach the issue of Palestine. Which brings us, of course, to the Coordinadora,
Yeah,
the organization that you work with, and the role that the gap that it fills. So maybe you can tell
yeah.
us a little bit more about that.
I think it does. I think it in the same way that in other countries in Latin America, you have a layer of Arab capitalists uh, that you can tell that they see themselves. I mean, they claim their Palestinian heritage as a favor to their being capitalists in that country in particular. It's not that they maybe they say it or feel it by the way, but the way that they behave collectively is not as being fundamentally Palestinians fighting for Palestinian liberation or the rebuilding of Palestine. And my impression, and this is what I've seen, or what I think I've understood in the past 20 months, is that there's a layer of Arab capitalists in Latin America that they see themselves, and probably this is the same in other countries in Europe and in the US, for instance. They see themselves, the ones that have power, they see themselves as the future owners of the state of Palestine, if it ever comes to happen, you know? I mean, they want to be that in that layer of that other society that they would be part of eventually. And so this is how they relate to Palestine. They invest in Palestine. They provide some of that uh, investment in the way of donations to cultural and healthcare and feeding hungry kids in Gaza or in
So very
other
much like
places.
humanitarian focused.
So it's a mix of humanitarian solutions, but at the same time, they are investing in hotels, in commerce, in
Factories
development, and own factories, and owning, property
in Palestine,
um,
to be clear.
in Palestine. Yeah,
Yeah.
in Palestine. So they are sort of like building like in two steps, and being recognized as very humanitarian, um, charitable, rich people who want to help the poor kids in Palestine, but at the same time being recognized by the PLO and the PA as, partners when it comes to funding whatever project that they may have. Um, and I think this is interesting because it can help you understand why in many countries in Latin America there's a clear gap between you can I think it's basically the same, but between the rich and the Palestinians and the rest, or between right wing Palestinians and the rest. Um, and it depends on every country, in each country, how many people there are, what's their distribution across the income spectrum, but that gap is always there, and it has a correlate. It has like a parallel in terms of local politics, which I think is very interesting, is that rich Palestinians who tend to be right wing, they see the struggle for Palestinian liberation or the building of a Palestinian state as something, or the history of, contemporary Palestine as completely and radically different from the history of colonialism in South America.
Hmm.
And so they don't see any connection between indigenous struggles in our own colonial republics
Mhm,
and the situation in Palestine.
mhm, mhm.
Um, so for them, Palestine is not a universal issue. It's or. it's not part of a larger issue, which would be colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, whatever you want to call it. But it's not a political element within the global context.
They're
It's
not
a
seeing these
particular
parallels at all.
no. It's
Yeah,
it's a kind of Palestinian exceptionalism, I
right.
think,
Yeah.
which happens in many places.
Hmm.
And so that means that you have, on the other hand, you have left-wing Palestinians, um, some of which are, sons and daughters of those um, rich Palestinians who have become politicized to the left, uh, or have been involved in BDS activism. And there's and a lot of people from the radical left or the Communist Party, for instance, who are Palestinians or are very close to Palestinian struggle and have been involved in Palestinian solidarity for decades. Um, and there has always been a difficulty in building a unified space for all of the Palestinian community in Chile. It, we used to have the Palestinian Federation that basically was a, like big tent organization for the general students, the General Union for Palestinian Students. You had the federation itself had some kind of leadership that was shared between some people in the center and some people in the left. But then since I don't know the past 5 or 10 years, it dissolved completely and it collapsed it into a single entity that in Chile is called the Comunidad Palestina, the Palestinian community. So they take the name of the whole community, and they are basically the ones who are recognized by the PLO. Two of their members became members of the Central Committee of the PLO some months ago, weeks ago. And they basically, their work is to represent the Palestinians before the state and the rest of Chilean society. Or they claim, even though they claim they don't represent everyone, their actions tell you that they want to make that claim. They want to be the only
They want to speak on
people.
behalf. Yeah.
Yeah, and to, for instance, to members of Congress, to the government, and so they operate on
Internationally.
internationally, and so they operate in those in in the circles of power most. Um,
So that's basically the landscape by which Palestinian organizing really existed in Chile recently. But then October 7th happens and some new organizations emerge, including the Coordinadora, right?
yeah,
So basically, what are those gaps that the Coordinadora fills?
what happened after October 7th was that since there was not a politicized leadership, and it was mostly about humanitarian action and diplomatic action or political action on on the legislation level. So by the time I don't know, like October 10th, you were seeing that everyone, everywhere in the world, big capitals everywhere, you saw huge marches and rallies and demonstrations for Palestine. And in Chile, there's nothing happening. And for me, that was like just it was simply like shocking that we were allegedly the largest Palestinian community outside the Middle East, and there was nothing happened. I think there are reasons to explain that, but I want to keep that for later. But what some of us saw from, I would say, from the left, from the organized left, um, we noted that something had to be done. We noted that there was the people who were BDS activists or had been involved in student organizing as Palestinians, they didn't have a space to launch or call for rallies or demonstrations. And so we, um, my political organization that's called Solidaridad, it's a small political movement from the libertarian left, critical Marxism and feminist group. We explicitly called, other groups to organize a rally on, I don't know, it was like, I guess, October 12th or something. And so
And
we
other
found
non-Palestinian groups.
non-Palestinian
Yeah.
groups, or and it was social movements like environmentalist groups, feminist movements, um, political collectives on the left, but also the Communist Party that it is right now part of the ruling coalition. So we were trying to involve all actors that we felt that were willing to, you know, mobilize for Palestine. Um, and we saw a lot of interest. And so, like several, dozens of organizations wanted to be part of that kind of effort. And so at first it was only like calling for a couple of rallies, but then we realized that we needed to form something, like create a platform for that. And so that's when the Coordinadora por Palestina was born. It's the Coordinating Committee for Palestine or something like that. And that meant that we were able to fill one gap that was taking people, not just Palestinians, but also Chileans, to the street. That's one thing. We organized the first big rally or march in November 4th. And then we also filled another gap, which is connecting the Chilean social movements and political groups with the Palestinian solidarity movement in an active way. So not just them going, those other groups, like putting out statements or showing up at the demonstrations that were called by other Palestinian groups, but getting them actively involved in the Palestinian solidarity, scene or movement. And I think those two have been very relevant in building a sort of like a shared sense of what's the place of the Palestinian struggle in today's international politics. Because it gave them a space for some of them who had for a long time been in solidarity with Palestine, being part of campaigns and I don't know, like going out to the streets in 2014, 2018, 2021, like in every moment that Israel would bomb Gaza or try to destroy a neighborhood in the West Bank, there were people mobilizing. But they were not part of a shared space with common debate and common ideas and objectives, in this case, particularly calling the Chilean government to break ties with Israel and calling for BDS kind of actions. And so I think it was very important to do that because we provided a space, a platform for that kind of solidarity. And then we started seeing that a lot of individuals, not just groups or movements, individuals who have always felt their solidarity with Palestine, that they recognize that it's an oppressed people, and that they know that we as Chileans experience times of oppression, or that the Mapuche indigenous groups in Chile, they experience oppression permanently. Those individuals wanted also to join. And this is different from other Palestinian groups that it's made only of Palestinians or
And they
mostly
don't
by
and they
Palestinians.
don't make those connections. They don't make those connections to other issues in Chile, the indigenous
They don't
struggle in Chile, or international issues
they don't want to make the connections. It's not just that they don't see them, it's that they avoid them
Mhm.
explicitly. And so it's like, I don't know, we're trying to organize a rally, and there's an act at the end, an event, and people are talking, like giving out statements, and they say, well, but please don't talk about other political issues that have nothing to do with Palestine. And it's like, how how can it be uh, like unrelated if it's basically the same process? I mean, I think this is what I think, that from the perspective of a not entirely post-colonial country in Latin America, like Chile, what we could say is that what we are seeing in Palestine is the 21st century version um, of the kind of settler colonialism that created our own societies. So it's like we're seeing it in real time on our cell phones. We are seeing it in not in 200 or 300 years, but in less than a century, and we're seeing it with modern technology. So basically, what if everything follows the same course? What we are going to end up seeing is Israel becoming the only country and the only state in the entire territory from the river to the sea, and the Palestinian becoming a minority subordinated completely to that state, which is exactly what happens in Latin American countries who are colonized by the Spanish, or in the US or any other settler colonialist society. And so if you don't see that connection, then the question is, you can be an idiot, and that's a thing, but then it doesn't take you very far if that's your line of argument. You have to start thinking of what are the collective interest that motivates that guides or drives that kind of thinking, And I think this has to do with class, and it has to do with power politics, and with something that we were talking before, is the role that they claim for themselves
in the
as
state.
Palestinians in the diaspora in the state of Palestine, in an eventual state of Palestine. And so, what are the kind of actions, the kind of connections they're willing to do? Because they are the capitalists in Chile. So they don't want indigenous liberation in Chile, because that would mean the expropriation of land, the transformation of the political dynamics in Chile, changing the racial dynamics in Chile. So this duality of being both Chileans and Palestinians means that they
They have to
have
minimize the Palestinian-ness.
in Chile and maximize it in Palestine.
Hmm.
But with the wealth and the resources that they have as Chileans. So it's a mess in terms of social analysis and political analysis. But I think that if we don't introduce the class element in the analysis, we only see confusion, and it's
Hmm.
just like a egomaniac
Or it's
struggle
like
for
some sort
being
of cognitive dissonance on their part, but it's unless you understand the
exact
class dimension of this, you're missing the point of why
exactly
Palestinians and Chile, kind of the limits of diaspora. Diaspora affinity is
exactly.
not enough to
And this is something that also happens in Palestine, like the role of the PA.
the role of a
It
particular
has
elite. Yeah,
it has to do with with a class element
yeah.
and the reproduction of that position in society. But then at the same time, every national movement or every national liberation movement has dealt with this problem of one nation, several classes, so to speak. And it's like you can think of any anti-colonial movement, and it's basically the same. With the problem that it's one thing when you are in Angola or in Algeria and you are the left and I don't know, the working class struggling for both national liberation and socialism in Algeria, and at the same time struggling side by side with the bourgeois nationalists against the French, and then have to deal with the whole problem of class in your society. And then it's completely different when you have to, deal with those issues in the diaspora when you're not there, where the confrontation between those different like class positions are immediately and urgently relevant.
Hmm. Hmm.
So this means that it's a good and a bad thing. It's a bad thing because we have to, in a way, accept that there's no way that the Chilean Palestinian movement could be effective in its goals without somehow um, sitting at the table with the fascists who are Palestinians, some of them, who are, I don't know, like they claim the legacies of the dictatorship, and they are completely racist with everyone else, and they think that they are rich because the Chileans were lazy and they were hard workers, you know. Um, but then it's good because it teaches you how to navigate the problem of national interests and class interests. So it's a good lesson especially for the left, because they don't care, They can do without us. they can they have enough power. I mean, the right-wing Palestinians, they have enough power to um, do their thing. But sometimes they need the rabble, they need the people when some
Social support.
things, exactly. When they
I
need people in
mean,
the streets, they
yeah.
they start looking at us.
Honestly, everything you're saying is like it also kind of makes me think like the limits of a national project, the limits of pursuing liberation for Palestinians from purely a national liberation perspective. And that's a very difficult thing to think about because this has obviously been the crux of the movement and the struggle since its inception. Um, I want to broaden a little bit and kind of end on the broader note about broader Chilean politics and what the Palestinians, I mean, we've already kind of touched on the Palestinian role in both during the Allende years as well as during the dictatorship. Um, but more modern Chilean politics, you have large-scale protests in 2019 that I think really color the politics of today's Chile. Kind of maybe you can correct me, but kind of the disappointment of the 2019 protest movement colors the politics of Chile today. You have a leftist president, Boric, who's, finishing out his term. Um,
Allegedly
alleged,
leftist.
allegedly,
Al-
by definition, by his self-definition, you have likely right-wing some version, some flavor of a very far right wing coming in. And then all of the, Chile as part of Latin America, though of course I would say a little bit on the periphery. So there is like maybe some more movement, so some more space for movement, but still Chile as part of Latin America within the American orbit. So as a member of the Coordinadora and the Coordinadora as a group within kind of the larger constellation of leftist organizations in Chile. It, against this backdrop, what does the broader left hope to achieve? I know that's such a big question, but I'd like to hear about it.
yeah, it is a big question, but a good one. I just want to say one thing about what you say about being in you know, within the sort of like the framework or the space of operations of American imperialism is that a few like last week we had our own version of the State of the Union, the presidential giving an account of their work and their projections. And Boric, the president, he said that he was going to. There's already a bill in Parliament to um, prohibit the importation of products that are made in occupied occupied territories in general, and that would basically apply to occupied Palestinian territories. And they said that they were going to place like some urgency in the legislative process in order to approve it soon, to pass that bill soon. And also he announced that they wanted to, diversify their buying of weapons, and so sort of like he referenced the arms embargo in Spain, that kind of thing. So several days, it was like a shit show in the press. Most parts of the right wing being against it, parts of the center, even the part of the ruling coalition already also saying that they were against this. Um, but then the president of the Senate, in an interview a few days ago, he says that the American embassy had called, and they wanted to convey the message that that bill to uh, against products made in the occupied territories was not, if it was passed, it was going to have a cost for Chile. Like America was going to take its toll on Chile because of that approval, if that were to happen. Um, and that means that when you say that we are in the sphere of influence and operations of the American empire, it's that literal. It's not just Mickey Mouse, It's not just, Hollywood. It's actual power. Um, and and this is why I think Chile hasn't been in any no not one Latin American country has been able to break completely with Israel and do something about it, because every Latin American country is sort of dependent upon the will of the American empire. So the only way out of that may be it's uh, a planned unified action by all Latin American states against Israel and supporting each other, sort of like to buffer any attack by the US,
Well,
whether it's diplomatic.
the Europeans are because of how ludicrous the Trump administration is, like there is kind of this like interesting moment of divergence. And of course, it's too little, too late. A lot of it is lip service, but like they are discussing sanctions, right? They
Yeah,
are diverging from American positions in a unified way, or
yeah,
attempting to. So perhaps there is this kind of space of opening because the Americans are dismantling their own hegemony by their own hand to some
yeah,
degree.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, for instance, in the Coordinadora, one of the main points of our 4 or 5 point program in the beginning, our goals, of course, was to end the attacks, to let humanitarian aid enter Gaza. But then there was a particular element, the last point was about pushing Chile to lead or be part of a Latin American initiative, political initiative of unifying to sanction Israel and to be part of to create like a group. And then you have the Hague group, which would be they're going to have a meeting next week, I think, in Bogota, in Colombia, and it's so necessary that other countries join, and Chile should join the Hague group. I don't think they're going to do it because Chile has always been at the service of the U.S. And it's not about the government. It's state policies. Policies. It's It's like Israel for the US. It's not something about the particular administration. It's a long-term commitment with that. Anyway, so I think that in that context, we had a huge revolt in October 2019 that basically all the grievances and all the levels of the precariousness of the Chilean working class and the experiences of impoverishment and marginalization, they all coalesced in a huge movement against the elite for a constitutional change. It was mostly, like massive rage in the streets. It was not an organized movement. There were some parts that were highly organized, but in general, it was um, like an explosion of that kind of anger against the elite. Uh, with, of course, the demands of the movement were the demands that the social movement had been accumulating throughout the past 20 or 30 years, basically ending the the privatized management of healthcare, education, housing, etc., the pension system. So all of those demands were part of that. So it was the idea that we could change Chile in a, I guess, non-neoliberal way or post-neoliberal way. I don't think that's the most precise term, but in a way that breaks with the regime that was imposed during the dictatorship. But then we had a constitutional process, so changing the constitution became the main focal point. So all those demands that were like social demand for social universal rights, they were separate, and so they got all together and became the demand for a constitutional change, um, of a constitution that was, you know, uh, fr- fraudulently approved during the dictatorship. And so we had the process. The draft of that new constitutional project was amazing, the most progressive constitutional draft in the world. And of course, the right wing and the center, they made sure that it was not approved. A lot of people rejected it. And so
So people
in
voted again in another
well,
referendum and rejected
I, they
the
rejected it. Yeah,
amendments.
they voted massively for a change in the constitution, but then once the process was finished, they voted against. Between those two elections, you had one main difference. The first one, whether you wanted a constitutional change, was a voluntary election, and the second one, to approve or not the actual draft, you were forced to vote. And so there were
Compulsory, yeah.
4 or 5 million people who didn't vote for the first one, and they voted for that second referendum. And it was that sector of the population that were aimed, that were, uh, like targeted by the right wing propaganda and all. So that meant that we shifted from a moment of hope for change to a moment of defeat and hopelessness for change, with, of course, the mediation of the pandemic crisis, which had already shifted the priorities of the Chilean people from constitutional change and universal rights towards my own safety, my own survival. I don't care about the rest. And we were taking off the streets. And so we all became sort of like clandestine organizations, in the sense that we were hiding in our houses and not able to do stuff in the street.
Mm.
Um, and I think that if you take that element of hopelessness and demobilizing, the demobilizing effect that the defeat of the constitutional change had, with a progressive so-called leftist government, that is the voice of a state policy in Chile, which is in support of the two-state solution in Palestine, following, the borders before 67. It means that you have a demobilized people and a government that is, at least in appearance, favorable to Palestine. And I think this is relevant to the question we asked earlier, which is why, in the country with more Palestinians outside the Middle East, why is it that it wasn't the more mobilized country in the
Mm-hmm.
world?
Mm-hmm.
And I think those two elements, apart from the nature of the Palestinian community in Chile that we have been talking about, those two elements are key. One, people were already tired, exhausted, disoriented, demobilized,
From the
hopeless
2019 experience. Mm-hmm.
from the 2019, the defeat of that whole process of change. And we are not protesting our own state or our own government. So it's not the same when you are protesting against the French government, the British government, the American government, who are actively supporting the genocide, whether from the Democrats or the Republicans. You have the entire political spectrum supporting genocide and funding it.
And if you're if
It's not
you're if that's the government, then you're galvanized more.
exactly. You have a lot of incentives to mobilize. One is, humanitarian principles. You don't want to see kids getting killed. But then you also have the particular incentive that your own tax money is being used to pay for those bombs and not for your own schools. Your own government is the one that is saying that all Palestinians are terrorists and should be killed. So I guess that people mobilize more when the target of your anger is closer to home. This is something that happens everywhere, right? When you see mass mobilizations against the war, in Iraq, for instance, in 2003, the biggest rallies were in countries who were involved in the war effort. It's like Vietnam, It was not only about being against the war in general, it was about being against the fact that our kids were being taken by force to die in the trenches. And that mobilizes much more people, like mothers who don't want to see their kids killed in Vietnam or in the trenches in Europe. I think this is irrelevant. It's a material difference when it comes to seeing and analyzing and assessing the power of mobilizing in different countries.
Yeah, there's like a proximity there that can can be more effective, at least in that first initial stage of mobilizing. Though I don't, if we compare the Palestinian American experience to the Palestinian Chilean experience, obviously there are differences with the diasporas and their integration into power. But despite the fact that the Palestinian American diaspora is actually overwhelming in its impact on the Palestinian cause, how, were they able to shift politics meaningfully to end the genocide? No. That's the short
Mhm.
answer. Of course, they did shift politics, uh, Biden didn't run and things like this. So like there were some, I'd say like impacts, but then you look at the Palestinian Chilean example and it's a much less mobilized community, but perhaps by virtue of them being integrated into power, and as you said, this kind of proximity element, on the margins, they seem to have had more general effect. I don't know, on Palestinian, sorry,
Right,
on Chilean
right.
public opinion at least, but also kind of the
Yeah,
general
I mean,
outlook.
it's in Chile, it's both safe and respected if you are for Palestinian liberation. It's not a risk like in other countries, like in, for instance, in Argentina.
Right. Yeah.
The Zionist community is so influential in Argentinian politics and in public opinion in general that being pro-Palestinian there, or being an anti-Zionist Jew, it's very difficult. In Chile, it's like super easy to be pro-Palestinian. Everyone is pro-Palestinian, you know? Like only the extreme, the far right, is currently defending Israel, you know? Um, so yeah, I think that when your government, I mean, our protests are in order to get a country, a state, a government that is already favorable to a Palestinian state, for instance, that already recognized Palestine as a state many years ago. Our goals is to make that state to, I don't know, like cut diplomatic ties with Israel, you know, to place sanctions, to be stronger in their efforts to, you know, to push against Israeli genocide, whilst in Britain, in France, in the US, the protests are to, you know, to shift the favorable position for Israel. So it's a huge difference, I think, between those two.
Yeah. Yeah.
We want Chile
The
to make
landscape is
more.
different. Yeah.
Yeah, we want Chile to make more for Palestine. In the case of the US, you want the US to do nothing for Israel and stop funding it. And so it's like you're fighting the bad guys in a way, which is different from pushing the supposedly good guys. That's different. It's always different.
Hmm.
That's
Okay.
why
This
left.
is. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say that's why progressive or leftist governments are such a huge challenge for the left.
Mm. Yeah.
Because when they get to power and you want to push them to do more, that's even harder to get to stop some of the right-wing governments to do some of the bad things that they want to do.
I mean, yeah, definitely when you have left or center left or liberal parties in power, it has a demobilizing effect. We saw that with the Obama administration. Like
Yeah.
it, yeah, it fractures or fragments. I don't know what the word is. Kind of like a focused effort because things
Yeah.
become less clear for some people. But yeah, when you were talking about bad guys, I just remembered like the peep show meme, like, are we the baddies? I think in memes now. Anyway,
Yeah.
Pablo, thank you so much for this very informative discussion. I feel like it's not enough. I feel like I need to talk to you again. But every time I talk to you, I feel like I'm recording an interview for some reason. So maybe I don't want to overuse my contact with you. So yeah, we'll stay in touch, but this needs more discussion. And hopefully we
Yeah.
can do
We
it
could do
do it again.
we could do part two
Part two, yeah.
in a few months.
Yeah.
Let
Let's
things
see.
happen. Yeah.
Or let's get the right wingers in Chile and revisit.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Yes.
no,
Thank you, Dana.
take
It was
care.
great.